All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Philip Bell at the University of Washington College of Education, and today I'm joined with my colleague. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Neill, and I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington, also a former state science specialist from the Oklahoma State Department of Education. Happy to be with you here today.
Awesome, everyone. So as you know, we've been doing a series of monthly professional learning events for kind of two reasons. These are around our resource collection, which are open education resources that are available for broad use to support equitable science instruction across the systems in which we work. We've been wanting to open up examples of engaging in these professional learning experiences, both for state science supervisors who are maybe new to the network or who want to kind of revisit some older resources and some of the more recent ones together in community with each other, just to learn about them and how they might be useful to the work you do out in your day jobs. The second purpose is really to capture the recording so that we can post it onto the stemteachingtools.org website as an asynchronous way that people can engage in the resource. That's been a really productive thing. This is our last PL session around our existing collection of PD modules, and it's really great that you were able to join us today. This particular PD module is about 6 years old, so it's a little bit, as Tiffany and I were getting ready for today, we were kind of reflecting on the great progress that's been made around three-dimensional assessment since this resource got written, 6 or 7 years ago. And we would really encourage you to kind of share those insights and reflections that you've had around the work that's come since 2017 when this resource got posted. So we're going to go through a version of it, and we'll point out a bunch of other resources that kind of relate to the work that came after this one. And I just want to be kind of express my gratitude to the colleagues here that co-authored this resource kind of back in the early days of the ACESSE grant, as we were figuring out how to be of use in the implementation of an equity-centered approach to science education as outlined in the NRC framework. For today, we have a set of activities that we're going to kind of open up, and that this particular resource is kind of a really great format. It can be done in a very tight 1 hour format, like at NSTA. We've done this time and time again, or it can be, open up into a more, 2 to 3 hour slower engagement to kind of open up analysis and design activities around 3D assessment. So encourage you to kind of think about where it might fit best into the work that you do. Just to give you an overview of the session, we'll develop a bit of a shared understanding of what it means to take a three-dimensional approach to assessment design in the first pieces and get some examples on the table and some conceptual ideas. We'll then actually engage in activity where we'll look at a set of assessment tasks and kind of analyze their 3D-ness in terms of whether or not they're accomplishing the vision that's laid out in the standards. And then as time allows for today, we'll actually learn about some tools that relate to making 3D assessments even better and get those on the table. And then we'll do some adaptation work to kind of improve, particular assessments based on kind of how we see opportunities to kind of deliver on the 3D vision of science learning that's in the framework. We'll turn it over to Tiffany.
Thanks, Phil. We want to share with you that there are also some other resources that we have with ACESSE that actually fit really nicely with this particular resource B. So on the next slide, you'll see that actually our very first resource module, ACESSE Resource A, introduces people to formative assessments to support equitable 3D instruction. So that module does serve as a prerequisite for this particular module, ACESSE Resource Module B. And in ACESSE Resource Module A, it walks participants through an opportunity to not only discover definitions of formative assessments or review those, but also explore different types of formative assessment and provide some implementation ideas. However, we do want to point out that although ACESSE Resource A can serve as a prerequisite for B, you don't have to do ACESSE Resource A before B. As a matter of fact, one of our colleagues, Spencer Martin, who is a science specialist in Kansas, shared with us, and I know Phil has a little more insight to this, but he utilizes this particular resource B with teachers as part of his onboarding process to the district to help them be introduced to the 3 dimensions and the type of formative assessments that they hope that teachers will be utilizing. And he indicated in some conversations we had that when using this resource with teachers in that onboarding process, he finds that the teachers already are in a space where they're really eager to identify or find quality assessments. And so this is something that is desirable to them and they engage really quickly. And I think you'll see some connections to that throughout our time together today in the webinar. Additionally, another resource we have that is a good companion or fit with this particular module is a short course that is offered. You can find it on STEM Teaching Tools around formative assessments. This short course goes much deeper than we'll go today and provides many more resources that you can use to do maybe a fuller workshop or to do extension or add-on to this particular module or resource. So I'll turn it back over to you, Phil.
Awesome. Yeah, so when I was talking with Spencer at NSTA in Atlanta, he was relaying kind of his own learning journey in terms of engaging new teachers into 3D science learning. And early on, he would actually, open up a performance expectation and they do like an unpacking of the 3 dimensions and try to learn about like what's in a particular PE. And it kind of worked, but he wasn't satisfied. And then he realized that actually the resource we're going to do today, Resource B, was a really great kind of way to launch into 3D thinking from kind of a dimension where teachers really deeply care, like around formative assessment, like helping, make sure that everyone's understanding the focus of instruction. And so he kind of uses Resource B as that entry point and then goes back and does Resource A and other pieces. So we kind of wanted to lift up that example because it may relate to how you and people in your network kind of open up 3D science education in your spaces. So as we kind of just understand the challenges of 3D assessment design and implementation, and also the opportunities, we kind of wanted to get a bit of a shared vision on the table about what that can look like. Just to kind of name some of the challenges, in and of itself, like how can we assess this 3-dimensional learning model that's in the NRC framework? It was not clear when the framework was published exactly how you might go about assessing those 3-dimensional performances that are kind of mapped out across grade bands, across subjects. How is it different from how we assess science learning now or historically? I think a lot of science science assessments historically have focused on kind of being able to recall very particular subject matter knowledge, disciplinary core ideas that relate to a prompt, perhaps. And that's kind of, that's been state-of-the-art science assessment for a long time. And we're kind of we're making a pretty dramatic shift towards these science and engineering practices and kind of putting knowledge in use through the practices. So how can we design tasks that elicit these 3-dimensional ways of engaging with disciplinary core ideas, the practices of science and engineering, and cross-cutting concepts? So the National Academies of Sciences and the Board on Science Ed specifically launched a full consensus panel to figure out, well, what should assessment look like under a 3D science learning image that's in the framework? And they developed this particular report in 2014 that came out. And they landed on multiple models for doing the work. The one we're going to sink in today is kind of a multi-component task model for 3D learning goals. And so any particular component that kind of shows up in kind of a set of different components might focus on very particular aspects of a DCI or a practice or cross-cutting concept. But as a collection, then kind of a whole string of these interrelated questions help you get a sense of the overall space where students are at and kind of where you might want to go next in that formative assessment way that it guides instruction. So here's a worked example that came from pretty early work that we're doing here in Seattle and Renton school districts. This is a middle school set of performance expectations and common core learning goals that are stated in the left corner. And we were coming up with like a bundle of, how those things fit together. in a curriculum unit that the districts had adopted, and we wanted to kind of identify a phenomenon that students could open up this kind of set of interrelated responses around a shared scenario, which is the fog-to-mirror situation. If you were with us last month when we did the facets of analysis work on kind of the diversity of kids' ideas, this is the same assessment that we use in ACESSE Resource F, and you can kind of see a bunch of student work kind of in that resource to get a detailed sense of the longer form. But here we see a subset of the assessment on the right, and you see different science and engineering practices showing up. So describing possible explanations in the item 1, actually then posing a general science research question that would test a particular explanation in item 2, and then developing a model of what you think might be going on within the fog-to-mirror scenario as item 3. So you see different practices being strung together in this way that kind of weave together the 2D and 3D elements that make up the assessment task. Here's a screenshot of student work on a more refined version of the assessment. We had teachers in one of our middle schools that were adapting these assessments to be more equitable with multilingual learners they were serving. And so you see some additional design elements, and you see a range of student ideas that are being expressed across this 6 to 8 page assessment. So it's kind of a longer thing, and you can kind of get a sense of that in Resource F. So at a more conceptual level, the NASEM report then highlights this particular conceptual model for designing multi-component assessment tasks. So on the kind of from left to right, you have a set of learning goals that are coming from a bundle of standards, science, literacy, math, or other forms of knowledge that you're wanting to bring into the assessment. You focus on a particular learning performance of interest across those standards, so not all of them. You'd find particular dimensions that fit together. And then you develop an item cluster. So an item cluster includes some kind of stimulus for students to be thinking about. In our work, we often use kind of rich scenario situations that get described to students, perhaps with data or experiential details for them to think about that kind of frame the assessment task. And then below you see 2D and kind of 3D assessment items that open up from that. So the fog-to-mirror example is an example. So the fog-mirror is the scenario, and then you have these different assessment items that are doing the 2D, 3D analysis. Just one individual insight about this particular representation that's always kind of puzzled me a bit. You see that third item, that's a DCI cross-cutting concept item. So from a point of view of a learning scientist, actually all knowledge shows up through some practice. So the fact that there isn't a science or engineering practice in that one is a little bit puzzling to me. So maybe it's showing up in a more recall of information kind of practice. And so they didn't name it an SEP. I'm not sure. For us, when we're around a design table, there's a science and engineering practice showing up in each component of our assessments in that way that kind of supports students expressing their thinking, so it's visible to us to kind of analyze it and get a sense of where they're at. These particular efforts around developing fair assessments and formative assessments in our case here is very directly tied to the equity and diversity vision that's in the NRC framework, chapter 11. So specifically, if you think about the role that assessment can play and should play, it definitely relates to equalizing opportunities to learn, to make sure students are all kind of developing a shared understanding of the learning goals of the curriculum. It also can support inclusive science instruction, specifically by relating the youth discourses to scientific discourses that are kind of centered in different assessment systems. So how do we surface the broad range of ways that students communicate to have them express their ideas that relate more broadly to how scientists think about the natural world. And then the last item is directly relevant to formative assessment, specifically around valuing the multiple modes of expression that students bring to that moment. So their full communicative repertoires, and how can we kind of leverage those. And some contexts for assessment are much more generous in terms of bringing those in, and others are more constrained. And that's just a bit of the work that we have to find our way through to try to make these as fair as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to open up the activity for today.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. In just a moment, we're going to get a chance to send you to breakout groups with a few other folks to actually do the work of analyzing some tasks that we put together for you, and you'll get a chance to analyze them and determine how 3D or not those tasks are. So today, for our large group activity, we're going to focus on a 5th grade performance expectation 5LS21, where students are expected to showcase through an assessment how they develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So we want you to be looking at this particular performance expectation and the information from the foundational boxes here, as well as another resource we're adding to give you a little bit of background information to conduct your analysis with. So here we see the NGSS evidence statement that goes along with 5LS2-1. One thing to keep in mind here is that the NGSS evidence statements were really designed with summative assessment in mind. So there may be some aspects to the evidence statements that don't apply to our efforts to analyze the set of assessment tasks we're going to look at from the formative lens, but this will be a good resource to reference as well as you're conducting your analysis. So before we send you to your breakout groups, this is just a slide that'll give you some guidance for what we're going to be asking you to do in those groups. So in your breakout groups, we're going to give you a set of sample assessment tasks that are targeting that 5th grade life science performance expectation. Just a couple of reminders as you're conducting your analysis. A well-designed formative assessment will focus on a small number or pieces of a disciplinary core idea, science and engineering practice, or cross-cutting concept. And those, as you're conducting your analysis, try to identify those dimensions and see if they fit with the performance expectation that's being targeted today. So you'll have a link there to the set of tasks, and we're going to ask you to look at each of those tasks. There are 5 of them that we're providing to you in this set, and to discuss in your small group for each task whether they are aligned well to the 3 dimensions and that specific performance expectation at 5th grade or not. So think about it as 1 being not as effective and 5 being highly effective. We're also providing you a form to enter your responses in, and then we're going to take a look at the collection of responses from the whole group today. So as you're in your breakout groups, certainly walk through each of the 5 assessment tasks that we're providing and discuss how effective or maybe not effectively aligned they are. And then after you've had a chance to discuss those, we're going to ask you for each individual to go ahead and fill out the survey form so we collect that data. And then we'll ask that you be prepared to share when we come back out of our breakout groups about some of your conversations and your thinking as you conducted this analysis. So we'll take about 15 minutes in our breakout groups, and then we'll come back together as a large group and have a discussion. So we'll send you off in just a moment.
Awesome. And off we go. All right, so if you're still in a place where you're entering your final numbers, that'd be great. We have 14 responses, and having as many individual takes on it is helpful. We'll let that go for another minute or 2. Any reflections on the conversations you had after years of being in such conversations? Anyone want to share any insights about where we're at?
Well, I told Phil just a moment ago that jumping into your breakout groups, it brought back some lovely memories of conversations early on in implementation efforts in my own state. So I don't know if you all were having some of those same feelings or if you felt you just jumped right back into task analysis, which is your some of your daily work now. But it is interesting to think about 6 years of kind of doing this work or more. I wonder what others felt or thought in those moments.
Charla noted in chat how kind of nice it was to see shared ideas about the task analysis. So
can I share that having seen these items in this practice for years now, and being so long that I've kind of forgotten them, like I've seen them, but I haven't, but I have, but I haven't. It's funny how my expectations, I'm thinking if I was to go back to the beginning, I bet my ratings were a little bit higher on some of these, where now I'm just kind of like on all of my, it was so funny how a few of us in our group were kind of like, one or two, one or two. Like we just have such a high bar now for what assessment should be. So it's interesting.
that's actually a really great insight, actually. Like we've actually maybe deepened our understanding of what we expect and like what we're trying to design systems for. That's fabulous.
As a result, the survey is set up so that you have to select one or more of the dimensions of the performance expectation. And there were a couple that I would say none of the above. And that's you have to answer it in order to submit.
We had the same discussion.
All right, well, we'll fix that on our end. We have to like recalibrate to new levels of expertise in the network.
We definitely said, we went as far as 0 a couple of times, like, yes, forget it.
I'm just taking note of that, Phil. And also I just want to point out something in the chat box that is worth taking a look at from John, if you haven't already. So deja vu, flashbacks, maybe some PTSD on the shifts. All right, so we're going to spend just a little bit of time just looking at our group responses today and thinking about not only how those responses play out, but also some of the rationale. And I know Phil is floating through task 1 here. So Phil, any insights from task 1 that you noticed?
Yeah, a fair amount of agreement. So not a 3D task voted by the majority there. I wonder if some of the folks that might have voted a 3 wanted to lobby for a feature that they saw in it that perhaps others didn't see in it. That's the kind of collective sense making we try to do in this processing moment, to look to see what different kind of lenses people are bringing to kind of analyze what's present in the design. Here we see kind of only one person saw the practices in the design. And then here's the open-ended responses. I'll let you scan how your colleagues were judging this one. All right, moving on to task 2. So a little bit better on the practice front. Maybe not as strong on the cross-cutting concept front in an explicit way. And let's see if I can get to the histogram for 2. So a little bit more generous of a rating in terms of multiple dimensions being in play. Any reflections on task 2 that people would like to share with the room?
Bill, can you just scroll up a little bit?
Yeah.
So 68% indicated alignment to the SEP, and our group saw that it only aligned weakly to the modeling in the cross-cutting concept, but that the students weren't creating a model, so we would not align it to the SEP.
Charlotte.
Curious how other folks feel about that.
Yeah, thoughts on that one?
We talked about that they're using a model, but they're not developing one, and just have, I guess if you have to pick one, maybe we picked that one instead of like a different one, because you have to pick one of them.
And we talked about in our group how like we're picturing the, one thing eating another, but the question is about energy and the PE is about matter. So it actually is not aligned to the DCI at all. Same with task 1. And I think we couple those in our brain as experts, like so often, right? Matter and energy, that we just blew right through it at first. So
I love that. Like, we can't assume that students would have that same connection, and so we're kind of, our expertise is kind of shaping how we're seeing the responses, the design. Yeah. Should we move on to task 3? So just to remember what task 3 was, it was the friends prompt one. And let's look at the data. Also not that 3D, so we're skewed left. Missing practices. Only half were convinced it had a cross-cutting concept. Oh wait, I misread it differently? Sorry, that was task 2. All right, so task 3, a little bit more 3D. Still not all the way there. People reflecting on this one, anything you want to lift up to help others think about how you were seeing those responses, or questions you have about this one?
Something that was mentioned in our group that I really appreciate is that we are at a point sometimes with some of these more formative assessments where we're a little more lax in regards to, like, are they using the aligned practice, or is it okay if they're choosing a different practice, right? And so there's that kind of conversation as well regarding the intent of this, whether it was aligned to the standard or not. But with this one, we specifically felt that it seems so simplistic. There's no real guidance as far as explaining your thinking, and we would have loved to, like, I mean, at least hit more of an explanation or maybe an argument piece. It'd be interesting to actually use those terms and be really explicit in the expectations for students, especially for 5th grade students, because, you know, with how broad that is, the response could be super simple. Like, I think Maury's right because she's my friend. I mean, right? I mean, like, you just don't know what's going to happen. So.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. I know that when we're doing a task bundle, like a set of different items around one scenario, we will very intentionally design across a range of practices, including the one often that's in the PE, because we do kind of want to get a sense of that. But we try to, like, work broadly across all the SEPs, just to kind of, like, try to do kind of a broader set of engagements, so that, you know, we're getting a sense of whether students can do the broad range of practices. Like, that's another design goal for us when we're doing a broader assessment.
Just a quick note from some of the comments on this one that are worth noting, and it'll seem to be a pattern, is folks are saying things like, this one could have been amazing, but isn't, or it's a good start to a formative assessment. So it's interesting to see that pattern of people feeling like there's something here, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, so to build on that and Ricky's comment, like, hold on to those ideas, because we're going to have a moment where we get to, like, take a pass at these and see if we can improve them.
I also felt that there was a lot of cluing in that prompt, and that students could just take some of those words and rewrite them and say a lot, but not really understand what they're writing down. So yeah, it's a good start, but it needs to be massaged a little bit more.
You're flashing me back to a moment of teacher ed where you would use this. I think it's a pretty well-known activity called the montellation of Traxylene, which is basically, you can answer all the questions about Traxylene and how it gets montelled without knowing anything about what the words mean, like, just by, you know, parsing the paragraphs and trying to, like, string things together. So appreciate that. All right, task 4 did not fare well, and it looks like it is a DCI-centric approach, which, if you remember task 4, DDD, it is kind of a standard recall of content knowledge task format. And I think we can see the responses here, and then move on to task 5, which is the most aligned 3Dness example in the collection. And if we go back to everyone saw everything in that one, that's interesting. We don't always get to all people seeing everything. And the basis for the evidence. Any reflections on task 5?
I think it would be interesting to offer these tasks in different orders to different groups. What if 5 was the first one you looked at? How would that impact your rates on the others rating?
That's a great idea. Yeah. I think we've had that reaction in the past, just where I think task 5 tends to be the longest and the one that's like a little bit more comprehensive. So, mixing that up is a good idea, Shari.
Yeah, and as part of the module, you'll have access to this survey to make a copy and make some of those changes if you like as well.
Right. So maybe let's resume our thinking through the slides. I have to like stop sharing and then make sure I get the right window back.
Yeah, and as Phil is pulling that up, I think the next slide that comes up, and you'll see it in your slide deck, we showcase, we used a specific set of task examples for the 5th grade life science, but as part of the module, you also have access to sets of tasks for other performance expectations that might be targeted by 5. So that set of 5 assessment tasks, and there are examples for elementary, middle school, and high school. So depending on the group that you may be working with, you'll have access to those set of tasks.
All right, I'm almost there. Sorry, I lost my window, so I had to go build a new one. Let's try again. Google Chrome, share. Okay. All right, and go slideshow. Okay, so yeah, so we have a full set of these examples built out, and I think one of the nice things about this one is it does work across grade bands in a productive way. So we'll leave that there for you to go explore these, and kind of want to shout out Katie Van Horn and Shelley Stromholt, who did a lot of that early work, I think, pulling together these examples. All right, so as we then think about steps to designing 3D assessments, we've been kind of making progress on a range of different resources after this particular resource B. And in particular, I kind of wanted to lift up resource D, which we shared with the network, I think, in December, where it's really kind of intended to be a very full day or a 2-day kind of sequence of design activities for small groups to develop an item cluster like we're seeing in task 5. So like if you kind of want the deep dive resource and you kind of have a group that's developing new assessments like from scratch, resource D is your friend, and it leverages other resources in the collection to kind of open up that work. When we were writing resource B, we had a little bit more simplified process that's shown here in these 5 steps. So you're kind of defining what you'll assess by coming up with the assessment claim related to the bundle of standards. You'll then brainstorm possible scenarios that might elicit the thinking that you're wanting to get a sense of from students. And then you write a range of student questions using both task formats and the prompts for cross-cutting concepts, which I'll lift up in just a second. That process opens up more fully with student responses and iteration. The full process now, I think, is a 10-step process that's in resource D. And so we've been iterating on the design approach, but these 5 steps are still a really great starting point to get people oriented to the logic of assessment design or adaptation. So we have some particular tools that are, I think our most popular tools, among the most popular tools on the website. So STEM Teaching Tool 30 is the task formats for the science and engineering practices. We are trying to help the field a bit hold on to the multifaceted nature of each practice. And it's always a bit of a complicated thing to kind of define the practices in a way that's useful and doesn't close out kind of other possible ways the practice might show up. But we gave it our best approach. And so for each of the 8 science practices, and then for the 2 engineering practices that are most different, we highlight these task formats, which I think of as kind of blueprints for designing assessment items, or kind of a sequence of items. And you can kind of see here, each one has 4 to 8 different task formats for each practice. And they kind of roughly go from less cognitively demanding at the top to more cognitively demanding at the end of the list. So you kind of can calibrate based on the students you're serving, kind of where you kind of want to kind of leverage a particular format for that cognitive complexity piece. So that helps to get the science and engineering practice dimension centered in assessment items. The last thing I'll say here is that actually Trish Shelton, like when I was first interacting with her many years ago, she was confessing that she kept STEM Teaching Tool 30, I think literally in her back pocket as a teacher, because she would like pull it out and use it as a bit of a script to think about how to guide her instructional activity. And it's like, oh yeah, this seems like a modeling moment. What can I do modeling wise, with our students, like move to the next stage of the investigation? And she'd like look through the formats, and then that would kind of inspire her instructional moves. And so like, that's this other use that we've never designed for directly, but it's really great when you see those things happen. The other tool that is wildly popular is STEM Teaching Tool 41, which came a little bit after, and it basically has very concrete prompts to make the cross-cutting concepts actionable in formative assessments specifically, or summative assessments, but also can be used instructionally as you're shaping conversations with students. And shown here is an example of what one of those pages looks like, a little subset of the kinds of prompts that go with a particular cross-cutting concept. So you can imagine this one's a little bit more plug and play, even more so than the task formats, which require kind of adapting them to a situation. These are often much more like direct language that can be kind of cribbed and adapted for a particular dimension of analysis. The other part of this work in Seattle and Renton was around supporting multilingual learners through assessment and instruction. And so we have a set of different tools that kind of open up that work. STEM Teaching Tool 33 was our first effort. Dr. Carrie Wingert pulled this together to kind of pull together guidance from kind of language acquisition studies in relation to science instruction specifically. And so if that design guidance is useful to you within your space, we kind of encourage, like, this is a moment to sink in and try to work towards creating more fair assessments for our learners who are multilingual. And then I kind of alluded to the more elaborate process, and I'm just going to point to the tools that describe the 10-step process. So STEM Teaching Tool 29 is the one we've iterated on that can be broadly used for that purpose. And then through the ACESSE project, Bill Penuel and the Phenomena Affinity Group had, and I guess a kind of a group that spun off of the Phenomena Group, came up with this justice-focused assessment approach. It's the same thing as 29, but like with a set of guidance about keeping the phenomena and thinking kind of justice-focused. So depending on your context, you may use one or the other, depending on what kind of space you're politically navigating. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tiffany to get us to do some adaptation work.
Yeah, so before we jump into another breakout group where we're going to get a chance to use some of these tools that Phil referenced to adapt one or more of those tasks that you looked at for the 5th grade life science performance expectation, I just wanted to share, and I put this in the chat, some of you may also have examples of this as well, but a lot of the resources that Phil mentioned, at least in our state in Oklahoma, we leveraged those to help build out our item specs or improve upon them to help inform item writers. So again, we're talking about formative assessments today, but the tools and resources were also helpful in that way as well. So we're just going to do a quick refresher on the next slide of the 5 steps that Phil mentioned as far as adapting 3D assessments. And we're going to focus on step 3 today. Again, take a look at those 5 assessment tasks that you were looking at in our previous breakout group. And this time in your group, you'll get a chance to revise one or more of those. So the way we have this set up on the next slide, I believe, It's just a reminder of the process we're going to use in the breakout groups. You'll select one or more of the assessments and use the tools listed here. And on the next slide, you will see the links to the documents we will utilize. And Phil, if you'll click on one of those, maybe breakout group 1, just so you can see, you'll have a space, depending on the task you as a group want to adapt. When you click on the task, it'll take you to it in the space in the Google document, and then you have space right below to add thoughts about how you would adapt that task. So we're going to take probably about 10 minutes in our breakout groups. I know that's not a lot of time, but 10 minutes, and just pick one of those assessment tasks and think about how you might adapt it using those resources that have been highlighted in the session today. So I think Corey's going to send us to breakout groups again about 10 minutes, and we'll see you back here in a bit. Welcome back, everyone. We had a chance to look in or spy in on some of your documents, and it was some really great work going on there. We'd love now to just give a moment to the group for a little bit of whole group discussion. Now that you've had a chance with others to think about how you might refine those tasks, what are some things that bubbled up in your conversations or maybe realizations you were having as you were undertaking these task adaptations with colleagues of yours? So yeah, just you're welcome to share in the chat, but we'd also love for you to unmute and share anything you discussed or any realizations you were having as you were going through this effort.
I wanted to elevate something Bobby said, because we were kind of trying to figure out where to start, and she had noticed that like a lot of it all of them and the practices started with presenting a scenario to students, and a lot of the questions were lacking that. So we just felt like that was a good place to start tackling, is to figure out an interesting scenario or something to make students curious to start.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bobby via Tana. Appreciate that comment. Any other discussions that you might have had, realization?
Along those lines, Tana did a great, we came up with that great phenomena of a turtle in a terrarium that was going to be our phenomena to go with our task. So
yeah, we certainly saw. We certainly saw with your group, you were looking at changing the phenomenon. We saw several groups actually tackling task 3, so you must have seen some promise there as we discussed. One group I noticed was offering up components, potential components of the system or that students could utilize in their responses. So that was really great. Anyone else, any realizations or conversations you had that you want to lift up to the larger group?
So we kept going back to that standard. What is that standard really saying and meaning? And also about vocabulary. So thinking about vocabulary and working with students that don't speak English, and that we're not focusing on vocabulary because students can do that energy flow without focusing on producers, consumers, and decomposers, and explain that whole process. So going back and thinking about all students learning and answering those questions without the big vocab words. Always thinking about that and the bias.
Yeah, Tanya, thanks for lifting that up. I think we all recognize that when you are trying to adapt or write a task, thinking about all of these things at once, you realize how complex and in depth it really is. So we have time for maybe one more comment. Anyone else, maybe from another group?
Yeah, I'll go. Our group decided to look back at task 5. Everyone rated it quite high, but as we used the tools, we had a lot of questions around even the introduction for both Johns and in my group lifted like some cultural context that was missing. I was asking what exactly is the phenomenon? The SEP says develop a model to describe a phenomenon. And I think like Shari mentioned earlier, that sequence of assessments leading up to that last task made us all sort of like, oh, okay, finally one that's not such a mess. And so it was interesting to go back and just kind of surface some challenges that still existed in task 5. So kind of speaks to, it's never really done. We always need to go back and be thoughtful and revisit work that we think is good to make sure that it's still good.
Yeah, thanks for that, Leanne. You know, there's another wondering we have. So we'll step away from the analysis of the task and maybe task and your reflection on this module in particular. As you're going through this today, are there ways that you are thinking about how you might utilize aspects of this module back in your own local context? And if so, would you be willing to share how you might utilize this or where you might see it a benefit in the work that you're doing? Anyone thought about that today, willing to share?
I can go. I'm in Wisconsin and I worked for a cooperative educational agency, and I'm the science consultant there. And next year I have science networking meetings where I'm going to bring in science educators from our rural districts, our small rural districts, to do sciencey things. And so this is really fits right into my work with doing, I'm going to, do these with those educators, because I think this kind of work is really important, and it gives me a framework to build off of. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else thought about how they could leverage this or use it for work back in your local context? You're also go ahead.
I have we're doing some work with a county that has just requested just very specific, what does it mean to teach to standards sort of professional learning. And we've been working with them. And as I was going through this, I was thinking, there are some folks that we're working with there that are still trying to understand what 3D means. And I think that this is actually a really great way to teach just the 3D aspect of it by forcing them to sort of identify it and then add in the 3 dimensions at the very most basic level.
So almost as an introduction piece, you might leverage aspects.
Yeah, I mean, they've already had, I would say, an introduction, but it's one thing to find the 3D, it's a thing to identify it, in an actual assessment.
Yeah.
So just to build on that, Erica, one of the reflections I was having looking at our histograms is that they were much more consensual than most histograms that we get from running this module. So often when we kind of run this PD with a network of teachers, you'll have kind of bimodal splits within a particular item. And it's a really great opportunity to say, so why did people rate this a 5 and a 2? And sometimes, that could be a little bit of an awkward thing for people to voice their concern if they feel like others are seeing things in a particular way that they're not seeing them yet, which is why the open responses can be really helpful in that moment, because you can get some sense of why people were rating it like they were without putting them on the spot. But it is a very great way to, in concrete terms, make visible differences of ideas about 3D-ness. In a very ground, people care about assessment. They kind of want to be, gauging progress towards the PEs, and it just opens up great conversations in that way. And we didn't have too much of that today because we were seeing things in more similar ways as a community, which is also great, but not quite how it often goes.
Yeah, great point, Phil. One other thing I'll bring up, and I know I've shared with some of you how I utilized ACESSE Resource B back in Oklahoma, but early on when we were looking at making shifts in our state assessment, we utilized ACESSE Resource B to work with our state committee for assessment feedback and design. So the teachers that were coming in to be a part of those committees. And I still think it can be very useful to them to get that practice of analyzing tasks to determine if they're 3D. But it was a wonderful tool that came just at the right time when we were starting to make those shifts in our state assessment. And it really helped people move along in their thinking. And it helped them feel comfortable to give feedback on the assessment in areas where they felt the assessment wasn't doing what they hoped it would do. So lots of different ways I think we can use this resource module.
Yeah, so just as we go to wrap up, like this is a lot of the hard, good work. We were reflecting on that as we kind of saw you all finding your way into the design, adaptation work. Like, these kind of spaces can be really powerful for educators to like really figure out together how best to get a sense of, progress or where they need to spend more time. The PD module wraps up with this set of criteria kind of around assessment scenarios. And I think, Tanya, like you're already naming these issues, but how do we make sure that these are kind of fair and centered on things that, students that are maybe farthest from educational justice can make progress on? And like, how do we make sure that they're working there? Having that compelling phenomena or detailed scenario to think with in that culturally grounded way. Lifting up the broad range of practices throughout the assessment, and that often we're trying to think about assessments that are pretty quickly understandable. So we kind of leveraging everyday situations can be really helpful in that way. And other like resource D, goes more deeply into scenario selection. So if that's helpful, you can look for it in that module. So we do have the short course, which bundles up resources into a flow for a room, and then resource 29 is like the backbone of the 3D task design module, resource D, that I mentioned before. So between those three, there's lots to work with that kind of are really useful for the work that you're describing in chat and over audio. So thank you for that. At this particular link, we've published over 20 different STEM teaching tools on assessment specifically. So if you haven't looked at the kind of assessment layer of our resource collection, kind of across everything, you can kind of get to it there. And resources A through G on the PD tab are all about formative assessment capacity building. So I'll kind of point you to those as well. That's all we were hoping to share today. So these are just part of that ongoing co-design work around STEM teaching tools. We have some new modules coming out for review in the next few days. So stay tuned to your email to help us think about the next set of PD modules. And if you'd like to give us feedback, we always kind of end with this feedback form on the different modules. And this is a way to kind of, the groups using it can give us feedback kind of in a centralized way. So if that's of use to you, you can ask people to fill that out when you use the module, and you can fill that out today if you'd like. And thank you so much for coming today. Tiffany and I, know that you're all juggling so much, and we're just so appreciative that you came to spend 90 minutes with us, and it's great to see you all. And so thank you, and have a great day. Tiffany, any last words?
No, I was just going to say we'll stick around if folks want to continue conversation, or if they have questions about this particular module or other access work. We're going to stick around. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it.